Hi, everyone. It's Sue, and I thought I'd take a few minutes again to talk about one of our very early modern theorists, and that's Hildegard Peplau. And what's remarkable to me when we hear about her life and the kind of transformative influence she had in nursing is that so few people actually have heard of her or know who she is and how where we find ourselves today was so profoundly influenced by her. So, as much as we know the story of Florence Nightingale and her life and her contributions, I hope at the end of this short discussion and at the end of this course, we have a much better understanding of Hildegard Peplau and her contributions to nursing and where we find ourselves. So, sometimes people ask, is it going to be on a test, the kinds of background information that we talk about when we overview a theorist? And they're not. No one's. I'm not ever going to ask you what year you were born, what year specifically they wrote a book in her case or other things, but helping you to understand the context in which a theorist uh, was born, was raised, the things they experienced because of the time in which they lived, helps to really, I think, make clear that point that the theorist saw life and people and nursing through the lens of their own experiences in exactly the same way that you see life and nursing and the world through your own lens and your own experience. So it helps, I think, to contextualize the kinds of influences that a theorist might have had within their own life, and then how that theorizing emerged from those influences. So let's start with Hildegard Peplau. Now, Nightingale, hopefully you've reviewed the lectures on ways of knowing and on Nightingale at this point, and we see Nightingale really transformed nursing. We moved out of the shadows and became not yet a profession, but certainly we were educated in such a way or trained in such a way that there was real rigor to our methods. And that approach was quite successful, although it continued to be dominated by medicine. Right? So medicine dictated the focus of nursing education. Often medicine was involved in nursing education. And it was at the turn of the 1950s that Hildegard Peplau stepped onto the scene, and not because she intended to dramatically change things, but because she had that inner knowing, knew herself, knew her field, knew what she believed mattered, that she made huge changes, that we made huge strides in our profession. And it was at a time when the role of women and the role of nurses was really somewhat stagnant. So again, I'm going to bring us back to the slide. Consider the 50s and what life looked like for the average woman, in particular in North America. So for most women, it was actually, even at that point, fairly rare to finish high school, much, much rarer even so to go on to any kind of post-secondary education. So for example, to go on to college or university, most women fell into these traditional categories of work, so nursing, teaching, secretarial work. And almost invariably, those were seen as sort of short-term employment opportunities until you got married and began to raise a family and be a homemaker and be responsible for managing a home. At that point, remember I said nursing was still really under the thumb of medicine and largely taught by medicine. So physicians would be in a classroom teaching medicine, or when there were nurses who were teaching a class, the curriculum was dictated directly by a physician. And nurses were taught to serve physicians. So this is the time when we were specifically taught that if a physician came, for example, onto the unit where you worked, nurses all stood to demonstrate respect. We were taught to follow orders. So it was very critical that we were an extension of the physician and were reporting back to that physician, but we weren't independent thinkers. We were taught to follow orders. Excuse me. And then Hildegard Peplau comes along. And there's just this real backbone to her, based on her life experiences, that causes her to question that orientation. So again, look at a picture here. I kind of laugh and say, oh, how little we've changed, but we have. This is what a typical nursing school looked like. You had the matron up there. She's lecturing to a class. They're all, the nursing students are all wearing their uniforms. That's because by and large, up to 80% of your learning time was spent in clinical. So you were providing free labor. to the hospital where you were training, and then you had classes on top of that. It was a very stern model, and very much, again, in the traditions of Florence Nightingale. So up to the 50s, we were still moving through that type of model. And so here we are at the 1950s, and we've got Hildegard Peplau. So a huge transformation happened in the profession in the 1950s when Hildegard wrote a book. Now, she was profoundly influenced by what she had seen and experienced in her life. So I think 1950, we're just beyond World War II. And one of the big influences was seeing all of those soldiers come back from war. And if you remember, World War II went roughly 1939 to 1945. At that time, we didn't have words or an understanding of what it was like, the trauma that was experienced by young soldiers who went to war and experienced conditions that they were not in any way psychologically or emotionally prepared to experience, let alone physically. But it was the psychological trauma that we in particular did not know about. So now we talk openly about PTSD, and we know a lot about it. At this time, thousands and thousands of soldiers returned from the war, in many ways emotionally and psychologically broken, experiencing PTSD at a time when we did not have words for it. And our best response was, don't talk about it, buck up and just be tough. That person maybe is weaker by nature or flawed, as opposed to having any real therapies that supported these soldiers. And in particular, there was a awareness that soldiers had experienced some kind of trauma. And in the lay culture, so amongst lay people, there was a term that emerged around this time called shell shock. They would say someone came home from the war shell shocked. And people intuitively might think that they had experienced some kind of head injury or brain injury from all of the shelling. But in fact, it really was metaphorically referring to the shock that they experienced of having seen and been witness to such incredibly difficult conditions. And so that was one real influence. Another important influence was having lived through influenza outbreaks. So now every year when we say, get your flu shot, it's really important to get your flu shot. The message is not as loud as it might be had we really experienced an influenza outbreak prior to a vaccine era, and recognizing what it was like. So in the 1900s, from anywhere early 1900s all the way up until the 50s even, there were several really significant influenza outbreaks. They were so bad that literally they would create mass graves to bury people, that people were dropping dead on the street of influenza. And so for Peplau, who had, as a young child and into her adolescence, had experienced this, had seen this happen, and had seen the trauma that it had caused, that terrible fear, how this had interrupted the course of individuals' development in their lives. She really was influenced by recognizing that, again, the experience of trauma and the trauma that was untreated, the trauma that people weren't able to process, and where their life and their own psychological and emotional development was interrupted. And so she decided to write a book that really focused on the kind of work that nurses could do in mental health nursing. That was her focus. That was her area of greatest interest. And her book was called Interpersonal Relations in Nursing. And it was actually published in 1952, but she finished it just before 1950. And the reason it took so long to publish was coming back to that history that we talked about, that nursing was so dominated by medicine that in fact there had never been a nursing textbook published under the name of a nurse as the sole author. That no publishing house would publish her work unless she would put the name of a physician as a co-author on her textbook. And Peplau said, no, it didn't make sense to her. Why? These are nursing ideas. This is about generation of an idea of the role of nurses in mental health nursing, and how our role was quite independent from medicine. It was complementary, but it was independent. And so she fought back. She refused to put another person's name on her book. And she went to several publishing houses, and finally it took fully 3 years, but eventually her book was published to incredible success. There was such uptake of these ideas that really portrayed nursing and the intense role that we can have in rehabilitation of people experiencing mental health challenges. And it really brought about this impetus for change, not only change in the area of mental health, which was really quite stark, but also change in this idea of how nursing can have autonomy for the direction of our own theory development and our own educational development. And so again, this idea that nursing theories, remember we talked about those grand theories and typically would define those 4 meta paradigm concepts. Peplau wrote long prior to that identification of those nursing meta paradigm concepts, which happened in the 1980s. And so she just wrote about her own experiences and the theorizing that came from her reflecting on those experiences. And so you see that her theory is not as well developed in some areas because of that, because it's early theory. It's one of the very first early theories. And so when we think of Nightingale and her writing, where we cobbled together an understanding of her from her letters, and we cobbled together an understanding of what her theory might be from all of her writing, the same is a little bit true for Peplau. We bring together her writing in many different contexts and consider it one of the very early contributions to theory development. And as much as Nightingale was a turning point for our profession in entering this modern era, Hildegard Peplau was equally a turning point as the first modern theory that was directly developed with nursing at the focal point. And so I talked about those early influences around her thinking, and also this idea that at the time patients were often seen as objects. So we were very objectified, as opposed to this understanding of the person-to-person intersubjective relationship that Peplau saw as the center of nursing care. And so she developed this concept of psychodynamic nursing, in which there was a very active process between the nurse and her patient to develop relationship and work through whatever challenges were at the core of your patient's dilemma. And for this to happen, it was really critical that Peplau insisted that her own students and that all nurses come to understand their own behavior and their own internal conflicts and challenges in order to help others and to make sure that they don't have any barriers to connecting with people, but also that they don't set people off on a bad foot because they have their own internal conflicts. In the model that Peplau developed, there are 3 essential phases of the nurse-patient relationship. Sometimes you'll see a little bit of differentiation, a finer differentiation in this, but this is all you really need to understand in terms of the phases of the relationship. 3 basic phases, and this makes intuitive sense. So there's the orientation phase. And if you can imagine, in any context of nursing, any kind of nursing, it's where you begin to get to know each other. So an individual has some kind of need for assistance, and they seek professional assistance from the nurse. And the nurse helps the patient to recognize and understand your problem, and together. So remember, psychodynamic nursing is highly collaborative, and the patient is not the object of your care, but rather you're in relationship, collaboratively working to determine what your goals are and what your need and what need exists for help. And then it's really critical that you develop a trusting therapeutic relationship, and the nurse and the client negotiate those together. So that's the orientation phase. It's just beginning to get to know each other, determine what the problem is, develop a relationship, and define the parameters of that relationship. And then the working phase. Now you've got to know each other, you've identified the problem, you've determined how your relationship will unfold. And the next phase is really critical. In this working phase, the key job for the patient is to identify who can help him. Who can help him or her, and how can that help provide guidance as he or she moves forward through through confronting their dilemma or their life challenge. And so really to be able to exploit your resources. And the word exploitation is not a bad one, it's actually a good one. What Hildegard Peplau refers to is really making use of resources in terms of information, making use of resources in terms of people who can help you. So it starts with the patient. The patient is at the center of care. The patient determines through discussion and intense dialogue with the nurse who can help him in any given situation. and then how you can use that. The nurse supports the patient to explore his or her feelings, and then facilitates that development towards becoming more settled within your dilemma, being able to resolve your dilemma, and move towards greater well-being. And that happens through various roles that a nurse takes on, and I'll talk about those in a minute. So you've got, remember, the orientation phase, getting to know each other, determining what the problem is, developing a relationship. Now we've got the working phase, where the patient figures out who can help him or her in this situation, and the nurse supports the patient to explore his or her feelings, and they move towards resolution of whatever internal challenge the person is experiencing, or finding some place of peace with it. And then finally, we move towards resolution. And in the resolution phase, the patient comes to terms with whatever that internal dilemma or conflict was that they were experiencing. They put aside those old goals. Either they've met them or they move beyond them. Sometimes they haven't met those specific goals, but they realize it's time to move beyond them and move to a different kind of challenge. And they look to new goals. So it's very cyclical. It's not that you move through this once and then everything is all done, but rather as you move through orientation, working phase, and resolution phase, it begins a new process. You may not go back necessarily to orientation again, but you may go orientation, working phase, resolution phase, back to working phase on another problem, back to resolution phase, and it just continues in a very cyclical way. And at the same time, this process is very empowering for patients and allows them to move from a place of being dependent on their nurse or their care providers to having a much higher level of independence. I'm just going to show you this, and the link should be available to you as well in your course, but just to have a moment to really hear directly from Hildegard Peplau about her own life. So I really encourage you to take a few minutes to pay attention to that. And I said I was going to talk about those various nursing roles. So here they are. And imagine if they all make intuitive sense. This theory was written very intuitively and in a very straightforward way. So we begin with the role of the stranger. So a stranger, like anyone else, is a kind of person who would treat other people with courtesy and respect. And nurses in particular, as a stranger, they accept patients as the human being that they are. Do you remember that this theory focuses on interpersonal relationships? So it begins at a core of acceptance of the other as, for who they are and as the person that they are. The nurse also acts as a resource person. And so as a resource person, you can provide answers or information and also help the patient to understand the plan of care that's in place for him. As a teacher, you can provide, again, very specific instruction or information, and also enable experiential learning to happen. So it's not just, let's say, if we move away from mental health nursing for a minute, and imagine a patient who's living with a new colostomy. You could provide information about colostomy care, but you also have the opportunity to do some work with that patient around experiential learning in terms of learning the skill of changing their colostomy bag. There's also the role of leader. And so for Peplau, it's really important to recognize that nurses not be autocratic leaders or dictators, but rather that there is this democratic process and that helping patients to meet their goals and the task at hand happens within the context of a relationship where there is cooperation and full participation from both the nurse and the patient. Surrogate is an interesting term. Surrogate is a term we most often use in healthcare in referring to someone who does a particular thing for someone else. So a surrogate is someone who steps in for someone else. In healthcare, most often we use that term now to refer to someone who is a gestational surrogate or carries a baby for someone else. But a surrogate is someone who enacts the role of someone else. And in this case, if you imagine in mental health nursing, a surrogate may be someone who enacts the role of another person in a patient's life in order for the patient to work through their dilemma or their challenge with that person. And counselor, finally, central to the role. Again, mental health nursing is central to Peplau's theorizing. And the goal in enacting the counselor role is to help the patient to understand what's happening in a situation and really help them to experience whatever is going on with them and integrate that experience into their life rather than sort of tuck it away and think of it as separate, but rather to integrate all their various life experiences together into the fullness of their life. So what do we know about Peplau? Interestingly, even though her name doesn't fall from all of our lips, she's actually quite famous. She is remarkably well researched, in particular in Ontario, which is fascinating. There's a very prolific mental health nurse who is a researcher who has expanded on Peplau's work and has done a great deal of work with using that theory. She's from University of Western Ontario in London. But her place in history is remarkably well established, in particular around mental health nursing, but also how visionary she was. So 2 points here, and there are many, many points. She really was incredibly visionary. First, she believed in self-regulation, and that's the core of nursing in Ontario. This idea that we, by the status of our professional status, are enabled to regulate our own profession, as opposed to having someone else regulate us and tell us what to do. We are self-regulating. It's a profession that determines our expectations. Long, decades and decades and decades before that ever became a reality, Peplau began to envision this and to talk about it, and she really was an impetus for it. She also introduced, this is remarkable, introduced the idea of the advanced practice nurse, so nurse practitioner, clinical nurse specialist. She introduced that idea again back in the 1950s, decades and decades before that there was real enactment of that role, but it was her vision for how independent nursing could be and how critical nursing knowledge was, separate from medical knowledge and other kinds of healthcare workers. Her theory is, again, still used today, but largely only in mental health settings. And her contributions to theory generation are really, they're important, but not as important as the path she set us on, the beginning of this modern theoretical nursing development. And so rather than specifically say her contributions are related to her theory alone, they are related to the fact that she turned a corner for us. So Nightingale turned a page, and Peplau turned yet another page, where we began to be a profession in which we generated our own theory and we spoke our own words. And that was critical to the work that would happen over the next several decades. And so often now we refer to Peplau's work as the first modern nursing theory. And in publishing that, she sort of paved the way for other thinkers in nursing to begin to really ponder her work and also how they might conceptualize of nursing themselves. And here you go, practice question. I thought you might like this. So imagine this. Jacob is an advanced practice nurse working in an acute mental health inpatient unit. He's conducting a one-on-one counseling session with Sarah. In previous sessions, Sarah has revealed long-standing anguish that her father died when she was 5 years old. Jacob says to Sarah, if I were your father, what would you say to me right now? And this is part of his therapeutic nursing plan using which of Peplau's nursing roles. So is he being a teacher? Is he being a fixer? Is he being a surrogate? Or is he being a resource? And the answer is C, surrogate. So he's stepping into that other role to allow the patient to enact that relational conflict with the nurse in order for the patient to work out whatever dilemma. Well, thanks for spending a few minutes with me and talking about Hildegard Peplau. She really is a remarkable theorist, a remarkable nurse, and a remarkable person. And it really is a privilege to know that our history is so full of such incredible examples of leadership and vision, and we are all better for it. Thanks so much.